Thank you for that introduction, David, and good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming out this morning. And yeah, if I'm looking sort of slightly jet-lagged this morning, it was a 4:15 start from Dundee, so kind of sort of blinking in the daylight. But coffee is one of God's many good gifts to us. So you're told that as the caffeine kicks in, because the speed will increase and the jokes will get worse. So we're going to do a couple of things this morning. This first session up to the coffee break, I want to have us think a little bit about how we respond to just some of the common atheist claims that we hear. We're going to look at two or three common atheist ideas that I think very much been imbibed in our culture. One of them, actually, Brian Cox's idea that science can explain everything. And then hopefully have some time for Q&A, some questions, discussion before the coffee break. And then after the coffee break, we're going to go slightly deeper into one particular issue. And we're really going to explore the whole question of whether atheism is itself a belief system. Our atheist friends like to tell us they believe nothing. I think that's actually a great lie in our culture. A quick housekeeping announcement before we begin. While I talk, I'm going to pass around a little clipboard. I'll just start at the front here. If you put your email address down on the clipboard, we'll do two things at the Solent Centre for Public Christianity. First, we'll sell your email to Google, make a lot of money. That's how we fight. No, I'm joking. We won't do that. They've probably got it already, let's be honest. No, what we'll do more seriously is I'll send you the PowerPoint slides. Well, actually, these are, I'm on an Apple, but a PDF of the slides from this talk and particularly the next one. So if there are quotes, facts, figures, things that you're interested in, don't feel you have to write them all down. We'll send you that. And also, there was a third talk that I wasn't sure if I was going to squeeze in, and so on the way over, actually, David and I were talking about which talks to do, because I've got so much material on atheism. So the one that we decided not to do today, I won't tell you what it is, so we don't get people heckling and doing, hey, do that talk, not that talk. I'll actually send you a 20-page set of notes on that particular talk with lots of great resources in. So basically, we'll send you lots of really, really good stuff, as well as sell your email address to Google. So in terms of where we're going, though, this morning, and this is a big pulpit. You know, we do this series of videos we do at Solas answering common questions we call short answers. I stand behind here. This is why we call them short answers. But there we are, only being 5'8", but there we go. A few years ago, to set the scene for where we're going this morning, a few years ago, commuters on the streets of London and Edinburgh, and then where I was living in the time, actually Toronto, across the water, New York, Washington, so forth, were met by some very unusual advertisements on the side of buses. In large, friendly letters, they proclaimed, "There's probably no God, so now stop worrying and enjoy your life." I can actually remember the day a friend rang me up and said, "Oh, Andy, you've got to get down to London. There are atheist buses on the streets." And it was quite late at night, and so I think my response was, "How do you know if a bus is an atheist?" Actually, I have to say, riding London transport over the years, growing up in London, that's brought me nearer to God, actually, not taken me further away. But, you know, it's a whole other discussion. But those bus ads were paid for by a group of atheist organizations and really represent, I think, really what's come to be termed the new atheism. The new atheism was a phrase coined back in 2006 by a guy called Gary Wolfe, journalist at Wired magazine. And he coined the term the new atheism to describe this kind of group of very media-savvy atheists, men like Richard Dawkins, there on the left, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, no longer with us. And then on the right-hand end of the screen there, that is not Father Christmas. That is, in fact, Daniel Dennett. And their books on atheism, Advancing Atheism, Attacking Christianity, have sold by the truckload. I mean, Richard's book, The God Delusion, has sold something like 6.5, 7 million copies now. So even though Richard doesn't believe in God, the manager of whichever North Oxford branch of Barclays he banks with is giving thanks on a daily basis, but that's a whole other discussion. Now, the new atheism is an interesting term, because, of course, atheism itself isn't new. Although there's this sort of new face to atheism, it's all over the airwaves, as David said in his introduction, very much the air that we breathe. Atheism is not new. And I say that not to belittle our friends who are new atheists or influenced by their writings, but just to point out that the arguments that they're advancing are old ones. And that's helpful for us because, you know, even a cursory reading of church history reminds us that Christians have always engaged with skeptics and always engaged with those who think differently to us. And a lot of the arguments to what's being put forward by the new atheism are the responses to them are actually old responses. If you look at what Christians were saying thousands of years ago, but we'll come to that in a moment. But for atheism not being new, certainly I would argue the intellectual peak of atheism probably came in the mid-1800s, particularly probably around about 1859, when the rise of science, and notably the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, atheism's star seemed to be in the ascendant. And you can read lots of skeptical atheist writers from this time period who seem to be, sort of telling us, if you read their writings, that atheists could look forward to, an enlightened, kind of godless utopia. And the kind of idea was, I guess, by the time we got to the 20th century, religion would be dead and buried. That atheist secular utopia never materialized. The 20th century changed everything. 2 world wars showed the evils that mechanized scientific warfare could produce, and arguably the end of the Soviet Union also showed the end of perhaps the most modern attempt to create a modern atheistic state. And all those factors, and we could list others, mean that today religion is globally as strong as ever. This actually annoys many atheists that if you actually look at the statistics globally, atheism is flatlining or even potentially dropping. About 2.5% of people worldwide are actually atheists. You wouldn't realise that living here in the secular UK, but globally the figures are quite low. And that failure, I think, of religion to die out and to be replaced by a kind of godless utopia is, I think, one of the reasons for the anger we see in the new atheism today. You see, what marks out the new atheism from the old atheism, older atheists, a few generations ago, were quite happy to sort of point out that religion was wrong and sort of leave it there. So Bertrand Russell, 20th century famous book, Why I'm Not a Christian, it's quite direct, but it's relatively polite. He's happy to kind of make his arguments and leave it. But the new atheism, they're not happy to leave it. They want to convince people that religion is bad, is evil, is dangerous. And in fact, Richard Dawkins is on record as saying he doesn't just want to merely demonstrate that religion is false, he wants to remove any respect for religion in culture. He wants to drive it out entirely. And so one of the things that fascinates me about the new atheism is the passion. There's a lot of passion among the new atheists and their advocates. They're quite evangelical in some ways. Atheism is an identity marker. They introduce themselves as atheists quite proudly. Their social media profiles proudly identify them as skeptics. They're forming groups and communities online, having conferences and seminars and so forth, and even starting churches. There are even atheist churches. This movement began actually in London a few years ago when something called the Sunday Assembly was launched, and members of the Sunday Assembly in London, about 250 people go. They meet together every Sunday morning in a deconsecrated Anglican church, and they sing songs and they listen to talks about everything from environmental issues to charity work, and then they have coffee and biscuits afterwards. I think there's a sociological experiment needs to be done on atheist churches, asking, can you rate the level of the church by the quality of the biscuits? We can do this in Christendom, right? Definitely charismatics to high church Anglicans, the quality of the snacks after the service is a sliding scale. Donuts down here and, digestives up here, but there we are. Now, all of this, sorry, that joke takes the biscuit. The coffee's kicking in, see. All of this raises the question, we're going to look at this in the second talk this morning, has atheism become a belief, even a religion for some people? And we're going to talk about that after the coffee break in session 2. But in this talk, this morning, the first talk, I want to explore 3 arguments that are advanced by the new atheists, aimed at religion in general and Christianity in particular. And I want to think about how we respond to them. And then we're going to land this evangelistically, because really I want to then think about how we respond to atheist friends, neighbours, colleagues, and so on and so forth. Because really, at the end of the day, if we go out of here and all that happens this morning is you've learnt a few nice arguments, so you can go, well, hey, I'm right, and it doesn't turn into mission, then I failed. I'd love to see more churches and more church leaders like yourselves equipping people to share their faith with atheist friends at work and in the neighbourhoods and so forth. So let's dig in then and look at the first of these 3 claims that the new atheists are making and begin to dissect it a little bit this morning. So we'll start with the first one. Religion is entirely irrational. Faith is the opposite of reason. I think this idea that religion is irrational underpins much of the new atheism. Just to give you a flavour of the kind of language, so Sam Harris, best-selling new atheist writer based in the States, says this. He says, faith is what credulity becomes when it finally achieves escape velocity from the constraints of terrestrial discourse. constraints like reasonableness, internal coherence, civility, and candor. I love it. Sam, do you like religion? I can't work it out from that quote. Funny thing is, on this idea that religion's irrational, I was saying to David in the drive over from the airport, about 3 weeks ago, I was just down the coast in Plymouth doing a week's mission there. Really incredibly busy week. I foolishly asked the church leader who was organising it to make it busy, so it was worth my while coming, and he booked me for 21 events in 6 days. The church on the first night, I stood up after they'd announced the list of all the things coming up on mission week, and I said I found myself feeling sorry for that guy as that was read out, and then I realised I was that guy. But one of the things we did some schools work. We went into some of the schools. And we did various things in the RS lessons. But one of the most interesting ones was about halfway through the week. Mark, the pastor of the church who'd organised this, and I were getting a bit bored with our roles. So we decided to mix things up a bit. So I said to Mark, hey, next school we go into, why don't you introduce me to the Year 11s as your atheist friend? It's not a lie, I don't believe in Thor. So I'm an atheist with regard to Thor, Zeus, and the list goes on. But, cross your fingers and introduce me as an atheist. And so he did, and then I said to this class of 30 Year 11s, I said, Mark's my friend, but I also disagree with him, so I'm going to just be really rude for the next 40 minutes, but your job is to defend him. So I basically launched a whole series of atheist arguments at this class of Year 11 students, and their job was to defend my friend, the pastor. The first one I went for was this one. I said, I like Mark very much. He's great to go, walking on the hills or drinking a beer with. I said, but he's got the brains of a lemming. I mean, he's a religious person. Nobody with any brains believes in God. Religion is for stupid people. Christians are people who aren't thinking, and so on. I just really, really went for it. And you could see the class look a bit nervous and fidgety and antsy, and it was interesting. They didn't like, even the atheists in the class, and of which there were many, obviously didn't like where I was going. And then it was their job to deconstruct this. Oh, it was a lot of fun for the next 10 minutes, until my favourite moment, Year 11 student sitting right in the back row, half asleep, suddenly brightens up, looks around a minute, looks at me and he goes, hang on. He went, what's that bloke? He went, Isaac Newton. He was a famous scientist, and he was a Christian, sir, so you're wrong, sir. Respectfully, sir. And I went, oh, Isaac Newton. Darn, hadn't thought of him. And we moved on to the next argument. It's great fun getting these kids actually to see, they could actually see through these arguments. All the arguments I'm using with you this morning were used actually in that Year 11 class, and I role-played the atheist. And it was interesting to see, teenagers able to see through them with a bit of help. So, Sam Harris, what might we say in response? Well, I guess first thing I think I'd want to say, and I think this is important because I think we're often misheard in our culture, is I'd want to say that faith is not the opposite of reason. Well, the opposite of the word reason is not the word faith. The opposite of the word reason, the opposite of the word rationality is irrationality. Now, can you be an irrational religious believer? Sadly, yes, you can. I know many Christians who probably do sadly fall into that category, dear brothers and sisters, but there we are. Can you be an irrational atheist? Oh my word, of course you can. What determines whether you are rational or irrational is not whether you believe in God or not, it's whether you can give reasons for what you believe or don't believe. That's what determines whether you're reasonable or rational. Of course, interestingly, though, we can turn the dial up a little bit on this, because it's interesting that the word faith, of course, doesn't mean believing things without a reason. Our atheist friends want to try and paint it that way, but actually faith just means trust. To exercise faith comes from the Latin word fides, that means to exercise trust or confidence in something. And of course, every human being exercises faith all the time. When I bought a coffee at the airport this morning, I was exercising faith that the barista hadn't stuck arsenic in there just for, comedy value. When I got onto that Flybe plane to Edinburgh, I was exercising considerable faith, especially how long they kept me waiting last time I flew with them. And when you sat on the chair this morning, I'm assuming you didn't turn it upside down, look at the bolts, test it was all okay. You exercised faith when you sat on it. And if I'm being really cheeky, I often say to my atheist friends, do you have confidence that atheism is true? I'll usually say yes, and then I'll say, interestingly, the word confidence has the word fide right in the middle of it. It means to exercise faith. So you have faith in your atheism. Isn't that interesting? That usually gets a response. Steam out of both ears, but there we are. Now, the other way I sometimes explain this to my secular friends, and in one sense, what I'm sharing it with you this morning, I use variations of this material on the university campuses all the time. So I haven't sort of particularly Christianized this. So a lot of what I'm sharing with you this morning, I have these kind of conversations with skeptics frequently. And one way I often say to my skeptical friends to think about this is think about marriage for a moment. I've been married 20 years this year, and when I asked my wife to marry me on the 30th of August 1997, I must score points. I don't just know the wedding anniversary, I know the proposal anniversary. There we are. That's what years of being dinged around the ear do to you. And I knew lots of things about my wife. I knew lots of facts about her. I knew her character, I knew about the sort of movies she liked, the music she liked, I liked her personality, I knew the kind of jokes she found funny, not often the jokes I was telling, but there we are, and don't win everything. Lots of facts. But when I asked Astrid to marry me, at that point, I was moving from facts to trust, or if you like, I was moving from belief that to belief in. And that, I think, is what faith is. I took a step of faith and put my trust in her. Now, if you were to be hyper-skeptical this morning and say, okay, can you justify your faith in your wife, Andy? Can you give me 100% evidence, proof, as it were, that my wife is faithful? I'd go, well, I can't, because 100% proof only actually exists in the realm of mathematics. We can prove that 1 + 1 is 2, but that's about it. Actually, I remember making that point at Oxford University once, and some philosopher came and collared me afterwards and said, I'm a philosopher of mathematics, and by the way, we cannot prove that 1 + 1 is 2. And there are many assumptions about number theory built into that example. So, okay, we can't even prove that 1 + 1 equals 2. I couldn't prove that the plane I was going to get on this morning was reliable, and I can't prove that right now my wife isn't having a torrid affair with the next door neighbour in my absence. He's 74 and got a gammy leg and keeps pigeons, but you never know. I mean, stranger things have happened. Nor can I prove Big Bang cosmology, theory of evolution, many things. Rather, in theology and in philosophy, in science and history, in relationships, what we do, I think as Christians, what we do most of the time is what we do as Christians, we look at the data and we ask what best explains the kind of things that we see and the data in front of us. And I want to say to my atheist friends, I genuinely believe that Christianity offers the best explanation of a wide range of data, from science, from philosophy, from history, from ethics, from art, from law, and so on. And based on that kind of, as it were, basket of evidence, I'm willing to put my trust in God, primarily because of the historical evidence of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And I always say to my atheist friends, interesting, that's the approach the Bible takes. The Bible doesn't give us some sort of highfalutin philosophical evidence for God. Rather, the Bible says, look, here's who God is, and here's what he's done in history, and working through human experience and so on. And then based on these facts, primarily the very public fact of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, are you willing to put your trust in God? It's interesting that the Bible doesn't construe faith in God as this abstract set of things to be believed, but a relationship to commit yourself to. I remember once talking to an atheist gentleman I met at university in Canada when we were living out there, and he'd come up after one of my talks, and we're having a sort of discussion along this basis. And I sort of caused him grave consternation, because at one point in the conversation I looked at him and I said, you do realise that God isn't interested in you believing in him? Wish I could have taken a photo of his face, because he looked at me and went, what? I said, oh yeah, God's not really interested in you believing in him. He said, I thought you were one of those like Christian pastor, minister people. I went, well, I guess I sort of am. He said, are you one of those liberal ones that I read about in the newspapers? I went, no, I'm one of those conservative ones that you read about in the newspapers. So he said, what do you mean? I said, well, the Bible is very clear. It says even the demons believe in God and trembles. Satan believes in God. He's been convinced that God exists. Is he following him? Is he trusting him? Is he putting his faith, following him with his life? No, he isn't. And I said to my atheist friends, that's what God demands of us. He demands that we give him everything, that we lay down our lives and give him everything in surrender to his lordship. Not just believe in him. It's not about some intellectual game of chess. Interestingly, that atheist student then looked at me and said, well, what right has God got to demand everything? And so, yeah, I was tempted to say, well, he's sort of God, right? His game, his rules. But actually, I looked at him and I said, because he's given you everything on the cross, actually. God's not asking you to do anything he hasn't already done. And I read Romans 5, verse 8 to him. Interesting. So faith is not the opposite of reason. So second common atheist argument we hear. So one down, two to go, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A together this morning. Second one I want to look about for a few moments is that one that David shared, that we heard on the TV from Brian Cox, everyone's favourite celebrity scientist. Right now, not to be confused with the old grizzled actor, Brian Cox. We never do that joke again. Okay. And it's this idea that science has buried God. So again, let's give you a flavour of what atheists are saying. So I'm going to give you an unusual one, actually. This is a gentleman called Harry Crote. who was a Nobel Prize winning chemist, but committed atheist, a bit like Dawkins and all the rest. And so Harry says this. He said, "Science is the only philosophical construct we have to determine truth with any degree of reliability." So this is actually basically a more sophisticated version of what Brian Cox said on the TV, right, David? So science can uncover everything. Science can answer every question. And I hear this from so many people, actually. I did a big dialogue at Dundee University back in February with an atheist from the science department there, and the university vice-chancellor moderated it. We had about 300 students come out, which is hugely exciting. But the dialogue topic that was chosen by all the parties involved was, can science answer everything? And it was really interesting to see how interested people were in that question. In fact, afterwards, the university vice-chancellor turned to me. I don't think he had any kind of religious faith, and he said, I was expecting like 20 people this evening, and there were like 320. He said, I didn't know that students on my campus are interested in the great questions of life and existence, Andy. So I looked at him and went, oh, they are, Vice-Chancellor, they are. You need more events like this. So we'll see where that goes. Now, why is it that people like Harry, like Brian Cox, like others think that science can explain everything? Well, I can understand why science has been elevated to something of a religion for some people. After all, look at all the things that science has given us. It's given us advanced medicine, it's given us clever gadgets and technology, it's given us smartphones and space technology and medicine, it's given us the ability to find comedy cat pictures at the touch of a button, all kinds of things that it's given us. But here's the thing I always say to folks. Whilst I love science, I think science is one of the best inventions that human beings have ever come up with. It's an incredibly powerful tool. It's important to notice that science has limits. There are things that science can do and can't do, and that's because science is a tool. And every tool has things that it can do and it can't do. I mean, consider a much simpler tool, for example. Consider the humble hammer. Now, a hammer is a fine thing. It's great to have one of these in your toolbox, and if you're putting up shelves, this is a wonderful thing to have. And if my wife were here, she'd say, yes, isn't it? Why aren't you using it? But that's another discussion. Hammer's a wonderful thing. But if you try and use a hammer to do brain surgery, maybe not such a good thing. I mean, maybe on certain politicians, maybe. That's a discussion for another time. But generally, we wouldn't use a hammer in that capacity. You'll have a problem. Or, think of it another way. Here's a thought experiment I use on campuses all the time. Consider the picture on the screen behind me. One of the most famous paintings in art history, right? Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Now imagine we want to ask the question, why did the artist paint her that way? Why did Leonardo da Vinci paint Lisa del Giocondo with that enigmatic smile? I mean, what's going on there? Is she pleased? Is she displeased? Is she constipated? I mean, what is going on in that smile precisely? Well, suppose we decided, okay, well, science can explain everything. I mean, Brian Cox said so. So let's scan the Mona Lisa into a computer. In fact, we've done that to put her up there on the PowerPoint slide. And we could write a quick computer software program to tell us what percentage of the pixels, the little dots that make up the picture on the screen there, are red, green, or blue. Interesting thing we could do, but probably no use at all when it comes to answering our question. Well, maybe we could break into the Louvre in Paris where she hangs, wait till the gendarmes have gone to sleep in the evening, and then we could cut through the bulletproof glass that protects the picture, take a scraping of the paint and take it off to a chemistry laboratory, and using spectrographic analysis we could determine what chemicals make up the paint that Leonardo used. Or we could take a sample of the wood that the painting is painted on, and using a science called dendrochronology, we could work out exactly when the tree was cut down from which the wood panels were formed, upon which Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. Those are all fine bits of science. 2 of them would get you arrested, but there we are. Not one of them would answer the question. Not one of them would tell us why Leonardo da Vinci painted her that way. Rather, for that question, we need a different approach. We need art history to answer that particular question. And so science has limits. There are questions, quite simply, that science cannot answer. It's the wrong tool to use to answer. Interestingly, some of the other questions it can't answer include its own foundations. For example, science sits on 2 founding pillars. The first founding pillar that science sits upon is the notion, the belief that it's the pursuit of truth is a good thing. But why is it important to pursue truth? I mean, okay, if the science that you're doing is going to discover, the cure for cancer or the cure for folk music appreciation or something, then maybe you could ask, justify the science you're doing. But I had a friend some years ago whose PhD was looking at the mating habits of a particular type of tree frog in the Amazonian rainforests. And I remember once saying to her, why are you doing this? Why are you spending 5 years studying these little red frogs? And she went, because it's interesting. And I actually thought that's a really good answer. And it's actually a Christian answer, actually, because it says all truth is God's truth. God has made this wonderful world, and it's good to go out and discover the beauties of the world that he's made. But if you don't have that kind of theistic foundation, why on earth would you waste your life studying, what frogs are doing on a romantic night in Brazil? But, there we are. That's the first question. Second question that science sits on is the belief that it's important to, report your results honestly. It's considered an important ethic not to lie about your findings. But why? Maybe some major grant for your university is riding on some particular outcome of an experiment you're doing as a scientist. So what's wrong with lying about it? What's wrong with misreporting your figures in an article in Nature, or burying a failed experiment behind the privet bushes at midnight or something? And what's wrong with those things? You ask that question to an audience of scientists, trust me, you see steam coming out of both ears, and people get very, very animated, because there's a passionate commitment to truth-telling in the sciences. But you can't get the premise, you should always tell the truth about your scientific results. You can't get that principle out of science. That's a principle that comes from outside of science. Yet without it, science doesn't work. So those who say that science can answer every question ignore that science has limits. They haven't even looked at their own foundations of their sciences, and particularly realize that they run up against questions science can't answer all the time. One more illustration, just to show how this works. One of my hobbies is climbing mountains and sort of trying not to fall off them on the way down. That is the Lake District, one of my favorite places in the country. And let's imagine you meet me on the top of that little hill one day, one sunny afternoon. One of those occurs about every 10 years in the Lake District. And you meet me on the top of Kidsty Pike there, and you say, Andy, I want to find out why you've climbed this mountain. And before I can answer the question, you open your rucksack and you pull out a whole series of medical gadgets. And you measure my heart rate and my blood sugar and my temperature and so on and so forth. Now, surely, absolutely, one answer to the question, why did Andy Bannister climb that mountain, is because my cardiovascular system is working properly, because if it wasn't, I'd be dead and I wouldn't be climbing mountains. So that's certainly one level of explanation, but that's not the real reason, is it? Really, to find the real reason, you'd actually have to ask me, and you'd have to listen. And I would have to reveal my answer to you. You would need revelation to answer the question why I climbed the mountain. Now, notice that my revealed answer, if I give it, if I say, well, because I wanted to enjoy the view at the top, and also that I'm working through ticking off all 214 Lake District summits identified by the great hill walker Alfred Wainwright in his guidebooks, that answer doesn't contradict science. But also, it's not contrary to reason, because you can put it to the test. You can go look at my Facebook feed for the last few years and see lots of pictures of Lake District mountains. You can talk to my wife, who will tell you we came back from honeymoon in the Lake District with 450 photos. Only one of them had us in it. The other 449 had mountains. She still reminds me this 20 years on. They say, long memories. And you could look at my credit card statements and see that I spend lots of money in the vacation, in the summer holidays in Keswick. And you could look at my bookshelf and take off my treasured collection of Wainwright little hardbacks, see how I've ticked off and dated like a true geek every time I've climbed mountains, and even notice the sheep poo stains and squash flies between various pages, like every true walker has in their guidebooks. So you can test my revelation. And that tells me Christians are in the same position. We believe that revelation is important. We believe science tells us some things. We believe that we also need scripture and revelation. But that's not contrary to reason. We can put it to the test. We can assess what scripture tells us. We can look at the evidence for things like the resurrection, for example, and see if it stands up. And all of that reminds me of something important too for us as Christians. We talked about atheism this morning, but so far this morning. But it's also important to remember that as Christians, we don't need to be afraid of the sciences. I meet a lot of Christians who are a bit nervous about the sciences. And my favourite example of this, I got a good friend of mine who's a high school science teacher in York and became a Christian at university. And he said shortly after he became a Christian, while he was studying physics at university, he went to, I think it was New Wine, the big sort of charismatic Bible festival down in the southwest. And during one of the services there, they invited people to come forward to be prayed for who'd like to receive the gift of tongues. Now, we don't need to get into the theology of spiritual gifts here, but just follow the story for a moment. And so he went forward, and the gentleman prayed for him and prayed that God would give him the gift of speaking in tongues. And the guy who'd prayed for my friend said, well, now just try speaking and see what happens. And my friend just tried speaking, nothing happened, no gift. And the gentleman prayed for him again, no results. So finally, the person praying for him at New Wine looks at him and says, there's obviously a spiritual blockage here, David. Tell me a bit about your background. What are you doing when you're not here at New Wine? And so my friend David said, well, I'm at university. Ah, what are you studying at university? Oh, I'm studying science. Ah, what particular branch of the sciences? I'm studying physics. That'll be it then. I love the idea that the spiritual blockage to receiving God's gift of tongues is studying physics. I want to be saying, hang on just a moment. All truth is God's truth. So Christians can be, committed Christians, charismatic or otherwise. We can have theology, we can have science, we can have history, we can have art and scripture studies and all these kind of things. We can have all of those things because all truth is God's truth. By contrast, some of our atheist friends like Harry Croto or Brian Cox, they want to have just science and nothing else. That to me is a bit like having a toolbox that only has a hammer in it. And that leads to a very shallow view of reality. So let's encourage them to think more broadly. So we've looked at the whole question that religion is for fools and intelligent people would want atheism. We've looked at the idea science proves everything. Let's look at one more common new atheist trope and how we might respond. And then I'll share some thoughts on sharing our faith with atheist friends. And then we'll have time for a little Q&A before coffee. And the third atheist argument, or atheist myth, as I've been calling these, I'd like to address, is the idea that religion is evil. I hear this probably now these days more than any other argument, that religion causes all kinds of issues. According to atheists, many atheists, religion causes war, violence, greed, intolerance, hatred, injustice, probably also causes halitosis. I mean, the list goes on and on. Again, let me give you a flavour of what they're saying. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, wrote this. He said, as I write these words, and as you read them, people of faith are in their different ways planning your and my destruction, and the destruction of all the hard-worn human attainments that I have touched upon. Religion poisons everything. And I read that and I think, oh, that's interesting. I've been up for several hours and I haven't planned anybody's destruction, so I'm obviously not informed today, but it was an early start, so maybe I'll get going as the day goes on. Well, how might I respond if Chris were here? Well, I think the first thing I'd want to begin by doing is pointing out atheism's own bloody history. I mean, atheism has a lot of blood on its hands. From the French Revolution to communist China, atheism plus political power has invariably been an unhappy combination. Hundreds of millions of people dead at the hands of atheist regimes. Now, you can go that way, and it's helpful because many atheists are not aware of, particularly Stalin, I think, is a particularly dreadful example of hundreds of millions killed. But the problem is, the one problem with going that route is it can sometimes come across that we're just playing a game of who's killed the most people. Oh, well, Christians had the Crusades, we were pretty inefficient at killing people, but atheists, you really do take the biscuit. There we are, back to biscuits again. And so, come on, in the grand scheme of things, we haven't killed as many as you guys have. Doesn't really, there's something lacking in that argument. So I'd prefer to go a different direction, actually, although it's still helpful to remind our atheist friends of this. Let's return to Christopher Hitchens' little phrase, religion poisons everything. My issue with his phrase is it doesn't go far enough. If Chris were here today, I'd be saying, Chris, doesn't go far enough. Take politics, for example. Doesn't politics poison everything? Politics causes war and division and hatred and violence and Brexit, or the European Union, depending where you stand in that debate. Politics poisons everything. Most wars are started by governments. Money causes greed, crime, jealousy, Simon Cowell, the list goes on and on and on. Money poisons, I can make that case. I actually used to have on the list, took it off, I should put it back in again. I mean, sex would be a good example. Sexuality. Look at the Me Too campaign in today's culture. It says that the damage that sex and sexuality have caused. Or science, actually, would be another one. Science causes huge environmental pollution. Science, as well as given us lots of blessings and lots of wonderful things, science has given us nuclear bombs, it's given us chemical warfare, it's given us a hole in the ozone layer, it's given us plastic in the oceans, the list goes on. And the more you do that, the more you swap out the word at the start of the sentence and put a different noun into poisons everything, the more you realize the problem is not science or sex or money or politics. The problem is not religion. The problem, what's the common link between those things? Human beings. We have this ability as human beings to take things and we can use them for good or we can use them for evil. We do it with money, we do it with science, we do it with politics, and we do it with religion. And so the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. The heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. And as the Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn once memorably put it in his memoirs, writing about his time imprisoned by the Soviets in the gulags for his political activism, here's a man who, if anything, would have been tempted to say, you know, politics is the problem, communism is the problem, doesn't. Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes these incredibly wise words. He says, the line between good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties even, but it passes right through the middle of every human heart and through all human hearts. Now I want to say to my atheist friends, now we're into a very interesting area of discussion, right? The brokenness of human beings. And if you disbelieve, as G.K. Chesterton once famously said, you know, original sin is the one empirically verifiable biblical doctrine. Just open the newspapers and you see human brokenness everywhere. And that raises the question, how do we address the issue that human beings have this split nature? We can be angelic or we can be monstrous. We can be beautiful or we can be beastly. And certainly human history would seem to show it doesn't matter how much science, technology, money, or education or politics we throw at the human condition, people still go wrong in all sorts of ways. How do we address that? Well, you may not have heard of the name Douglas Coupland, but Douglas is a famous award-winning Canadian novelist. Not a believer, not a religious person as far as I know. And I lived in Canada for 6 years, so came across his work. His books have sold millions, won all kinds of awards. And as far as everyone knows, he's an atheist. He certainly talked about atheism and made negative remarks about religion over the years. But then a few years ago, he stunned his fans around the world by writing this book, Life After God. And in the book Life After God, which is sort of a semi-autobiographical novel, he describes the attempts that his generation, he grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, the attempts that his generation, he says, made to throw God out and replace God with money and sex and other distractions. And at the end of the book, he writes an astonishing paragraph coming from somebody that we all assumed had no religious background or belief at all. He almost closes the book with these words. Now, he writes, here is my secret. I tell it to you with an openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again, so I pray that you are in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God, that I'm sick and I can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem capable of giving. I need God to help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness. So help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. And I always say to my atheist friends, with as much compassion as I can muster, look, I say, unless you can find something that can address our condition, that can address the brokenness of the human heart, then we are forever going to be doomed as a human race to use politics, money, sex, science, yes, and religion to behave poisonously. And what we clearly need is not more information or more money or more healthcare or more politics or more development, good as those things no doubt are. What we seem to need is recreation. We seem to need transformation, new creation, redemption. And I say to my atheist friends, if the gospel of Jesus is not the answer to that question, then I quite literally do not know what is, because it's the only offer on the table to me that looks like actually addressing the issue. It really does appear to be Jesus or nothing. Now, we've looked at three arguments together this morning. The idea that religion is irrational, the idea that science can prove everything. We've reflected a bit on the idea that religion poisons everything, that it's evil. I want to just wind this session up, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A before we have some caffeine and some sugar, on the whole question of how then do we take what I've shared this morning, how do we then engage with our atheist friends? Because at the end of the day, the worst thing I think that Christians can do is sit there, equip ourselves with material like this and go, fantastic, we can be smug and self-righteous, we're okay, we're smart, we've got the answers, those guys are wrong, and we don't engage. That's not the Christian way. That's not the gospel imperative. That's not taking the gospel to every nation, tribe, and tongue. How do we engage with the atheist community in our towns and our cities, communities, and for some of us maybe even in our families? Well, I want to do 6 principles for you this morning, and the first one is prayer. You know, it goes without saying that the simplest thing we can be doing is praying for our atheist friends, but sometimes we miss that, and certainly praying intentionally. And one of the things I often say when I teach this material to perhaps more lay audiences is, you know, a really helpful exercise is to, you know, from time to time ask the Lord, who are the atheists in my life, friends, family members, neighbours, colleagues, that you would have me have the most concern for. And just reflect prayerfully on that, and maybe identify 2 or 3 names. Put those names into the front of your Bible and begin praying for them daily, intentionally, like the parable of the persistent widow. Keep praying. Pray for opportunities to speak with them. Pray for boldness to speak with them. Pray they would encounter Christ. Pray that maybe they would come across tensions in their atheistic worldview. Maybe they come across the questions on their own. You'd be surprised how sometimes that happens for folks from an atheist background. You know, it was interesting. I was speaking in Plymouth, as I said, the other week, and we did an evangelistic men's breakfast one morning. Actually, that's a tautology. You wouldn't do an evangelistic men's breakfast in the evening, would you? Anyway, men's breakfast. And I spoke on the problem of happiness and how you know, we live in an age where we tend to try and find happiness in our career, you know, family, image, all those kind of things. And it was very interesting that afterwards, a gentleman came to speak to me, and he came up and he introduced himself. He said, I guess I probably would call myself an atheist. He said, but it's interesting the topic you spoke on today. So the reason I came is I saw the title, The Pursuit of Happiness. And he said, I knew I had to come. He said, because I've worked out there's a problem here for me. He said, because a few weeks ago I achieved my life's dream. He said, for the last 10 years, my goal has been to pay the mortgage off early. I've been working every hour of overtime, took a second job, you know, worked my fingers to the bone so I could pay the mortgage off the family, we could be debt-free. And he said, we've just achieved it, paid the mortgage off 9 years early. And he said, I thought when I walked into the building society, wrote the last check, handed it over, you know, was now debt-free, owned the house. He said, I thought I would be euphoric. Been working 10 years at this. He said, I did that. I went to the building society, wrote the check, paid off, debt-free, now in the house, no mortgage. He said, it was the most miserable day of my entire existence. He said, because I just crashed. I came out thinking I would be happy, and I wouldn't. I was empty, utterly empty. Not merely did it not fulfill, I don't know now what I'm supposed to be living for. And then he said, so what is the answer? It's like, brilliant, thank you. That's the very question we're going to address, I said to him this morning. He, as an atheist, had worked out on his own that atheism didn't satisfy. I wonder if I suspect because he has lots of Christian friends. His neighbours either side are Christians. I know they tell me they pray for him, so maybe that's what's going on. So prayer is a good place to begin. Patience is my second principle. You know, I'm a firm believer in the idea that in evangelism we need to be patient and realize it may take a while. You know, sometimes it takes a while for those from entirely unchurched backgrounds to be willing to listen, to be willing to take seriously the gospel. And sometimes I just wonder if we rush a little bit. You know, we invite someone to church, they say no, we never speak to them again. Best example I have of this actually is not from atheism. I do a lot of work among Muslims. My PhD is actually not in biblical studies, but in Islamic studies. I ticked the wrong box on the university application form, and it was 3 years before I was like, this is Arabic, not Greek. But, I had a dear friend of mine who was a Muslim, became a Christian, whose name, some of you may know, his name was Nabil Qureshi. He wrote a very famous book, a few of you nodding, called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And Nabil, a dear friend, sadly died, lost the battle to cancer last year. But Nabil, his story is interesting. It was 7 years one of his Christian friends was sharing his faith with him. And through a lot of those years, Nabil was very argumentative and very difficult and very belligerent. And David, his friend, had people saying to him, friends at church, saying, give up on Nabil. He's not going to become a Christian. You are wasting your time. You know, go where the fields are white and to harvest and so forth. But David felt, no, the Lord's put Nabil on my heart. And he prayed for him. He argued with him, you know, for 7 years before there was a dramatic breakthrough. And Nabil gave his life to Christ. And I think that's an example of godly patience, of going, no, this is someone I care about. And also, of course, if we care about our atheist friends, we're going to hang in there because we want to see something, we want to see the Lord break through. So patience, principle number 2. Principle number 3, although I've got a Baptist background, you'll notice I failed because it should begin with P, and it doesn't. Asking questions. Sorry?
Posing questions.
Very much, yeah. Posing. I guess just posing to go, really? I thought I was dressed quite casually, but there we are. Posing questions. Yeah, rather than like bombard our atheist friends with stuff, ask good questions. So, you know, don't take today's seminar on the first atheist you meet, download 35 minutes of content onto them. Doesn't tend to work. But asking good questions. is really helpful. Like if I met Brian Cox after that TV interview, I wouldn't say, Brian, you're wrong. I think my approach would be to go, it's really interesting, Brian, that you think science can explain everything. Why do you think that? Help me understand why you think that. And then depending where the conversation goes, I would ask questions and ask questions. And Jesus does this all the time. Actually, it's interesting in the Gospels, ask questions. And we have, at Solent, we have this seminar that we teach to lay audiences, to churches, up and down the country. We've been doing it for about 10 years now, actually, teaching people how to share their faith naturally, whether they've been Christians for 6 days or 60 years. And all we do in that 1 hour is teach people how to ask good questions. We take a look at the Gospels and show how you can learn principles for asking good questions. And it's been so encouraging to have people tell us, look, I didn't think I could do evangelism. I didn't think I was smart enough, clever enough, knew my Bible enough. And I just got discovered if I could learn to ask good questions, then actually amazing conversations follow. So learn to ask good questions. Fourthly, and now we really are leaving the P's behind, demonstrate the completeness of the Christian worldview. Just a minor thing. We talked about this at the end of the third point, really. Christianity offers a much broader framework for so many things. For those who want to just have science, that's a really narrow view of the world. Demonstrate the broadness of the Christian worldview. Christianity gives this wonderful foundation to science and to beauty and to art, wonder, morality. I was saying to David in the car from the airport, one of the topics I talk on the most these days on university campuses is human rights. And I do talks basically that tease out the idea if we are just atoms and particles, how is it human beings have rights and dignity and value and so forth? Huge conundrum for atheism. I'm finding that gets an open door onto campuses because everyone wants to talk about human rights. And no one seems to have an answer to that question. And it sets you up for exploring the image of God out of Genesis, and then, of course, how that image is fractured and broken, and then the gospel. It's a wonderful opportunity just through starting from that basis. And I'm reminded, of course, of C.S. Lewis here, who famously said, I believe in Christianity in the same way as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And I think we need to get that deeper, richer worldview we have across to our atheist friends. Fifthly, penultimately, remember the importance of character. I'm struck how many atheists have tried Christianity and they think it's failed because they've had a bad experience of Christians. They've concluded all its adherents are hypocrites. And the best way to overcome that is to demonstrate the character of Christ in our engagement with our atheist friends. As the famous 19th century evangelist Gypsy Smith once famously said, he said, there are not 4 Gospels, there are 5 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the life of the individual Christian. Most non-believers will not read the first 4. I remember being very struck by that. Friends who are atheists and skeptics, and friends in other faiths actually, the first way they're going to assess whether Christianity is worth looking at, and I would certainly be doing this too if I were them, what do Christians look like? And Jesus said that we are to be salt and light. Do we look like people who are glowing? Do we taste salty? Or are we, do people look at us and go, I don't want to go there? Interesting challenge. And then lastly, and we'll end here, obvious as it sounds, but remember to always point people to Jesus. It's very interesting when we get into this whole area of arguments and dealing with those who disagree with us and apologetics and all this kind of stuff. It's very easy to start thinking it's all about winning. We want to make sure we how can we win against Richard Dawkins? How can we defeat Brian Cox and humiliate him and show that our arguments are better than his? That's not what it's about. It's about introducing people to Jesus. And really, the way I view all of this kind of more intellectual, apologetic approach to engaging with the world is going, look, our friends have obstacles and roadblocks and baggage that prevent them from seeing Jesus clearly. And our job as ministers of the gospel, ambassadors of Christ, is to help remove those roadblocks so they can see Jesus clearly. And once we've done that, to get the heck out of the way, because it's not our job to argue people to Jesus, it's our job to point them clearly and then let Jesus do his work. And when that happens, it's amazing to see how the Lord steps in and uses our fumbling attempts at arguments and apologetics and persuasion for his glory. Okay, well, thank you for listening so patiently. We have about 10 minutes before coffee break. Coffee break's at 10, is that right, David? 11, sorry, 11. See, I live in Scotland, different time zone. Yes, back there it's 1970. Now, don't record that bit, just press pause. We've got 10 minutes until the coffee break at 11, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to chat to people over coffee. I'm a sociable kind of chap, but if there are any questions, fire away. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Chris.
Chris, fire away, Chris.
Where do you think the tide is heading in Britain at the moment. Do you think atheism is continuing to prevail? If so, in which direction is it developing?
Good.
Or is its felicity being shown up?
That's a good question, Chris. So basically, they asked me to repeat this for the recording. So Chris was asking, where's atheism heading in the UK? Which direction? Where are the trends going? That kind of thing. I think this is interesting because, of course, if you just listen to the secular media, you'd assume that atheism is growing. This great secular utopia is coming along, and Christianity is doomed. But then I had a friend of mine who wrote a book about 3 years ago now called God's Unwelcome Recovery. If you're interested, it's a great book to read, published by Lion Books out of Oxford. And basically, Sean does two things in that book. Firstly, he looks at the actual statistics, and particularly when you dive below the mainstream churches, because the sociologists tend to look at the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and maybe some of the mainstream, like the Baptists and things, who have membership rolls. But Sean, my friend who wrote the book, dives much deeper. And when you start looking at things like the house church movement, the free churches, churches that are sort of free evangelical, not associated to anybody, and then certainly the Pentecostal lot. I mean, I grew up in South London. You can't lob a brick in Brixton without hitting like 10 large black Pentecostal churches. And so Sean crunches all of those numbers, and he's going, actually, the church in the UK appears to be growing. We're not talking Welsh revival, but it does appear to be in recovery, which is encouraging. And then actually I was at the National Prayer Breakfast in Scotland, in Edinburgh, a few weeks ago, and during the Q&A, a lady asked a question, and she referred to, she said, how do Christians we engage with this quiet revival that's happening in the UK? And I like that phrase, because everywhere I go, I see this. I don't know what it's like down at this end of the country. It's been 8 years since I lived in the south, because I was in Canada and in Scotland. But in Scotland, everywhere I go, I see there's growth. Now, sometimes it's dramatic, but the church we attend in Dundee was 100 people 10 years ago, is 300 people today. Lots of smaller churches saying, oh yeah, we're baptizing people, there's new growth, the CU meetings we're attending are full. So I think something's happening, and I like quiet revival, because we're calm down, it's not like there's a great wave coming. I think our question is, how do we engage? And it's interesting, Sean called his book God's Unwelcome Recovery. There's a sting in the tail. Why is it unwelcome? Well, the secular press don't want to tell that story. But he said often for Christians, if we're honest with ourselves, it's easier if we can just circle the wagons, sit in little holy huddles and go, isn't it desperate out there and no one's interested? You go, no, stuff is happening, but that means we need bravery because we need to get out those doors and engage. Aslan is on the move, and if we're not careful, we're going to be the other side of Narnia and he's going to be away over the hills. How do we keep up? So I think lots of exciting things are happening. I see that in all kinds of places, Chris. The other thing I think as well, just to add to that, I think you talked about is atheism being exposed. I think what is being exposed is trying to live your life purely based on the material is being exposed. It's coming out in things like, look at the growth of anxiety and depression among university students. Look at the crisis among young women who we've been telling it's all about your image and your looks and sexuality and everything. We wonder why there are issues. I think things like the Me Too movement, those other things are exposing some deep-rooted things in our culture that are what happens if you chase the transcendent out. So I think we're at a very interesting cultural time. I meet a lot more young people who are willing to say, tell me about this Christianity thing, because I've tried living that way. And it's interesting. I mean, there's a stat in the paper I read just the other day, the average age now at which a person in the UK loses their virginity, interesting secular age, 26. Because people are saying, we've tried the free love thing, it ain't working. And people are turning their backs on it. So I think the question for us as church leaders and for the churches that we lead and influence, how do we equip our people to get out there to engage? The battle's changing, there's an openness, but also we need to be equipped for it. Does that help a little bit, Chris? Yeah, good, I'm encouraged. Okay, I've only got time for one more question, if there is one. Yes, sir, what's your name?
Mike.
Hi, Mike.
I walked in Portsmouth Library the other day and I want to stand right in front of me with this book called Atheism.
Yes, Christians.
I'm well into reading it, but I'm trying to absorb it. It seems to me that, talking about on the board, sharing the gospel with atheist friends, it seems to have a very good approach. But it's one of respect for different positions, and really that they are both belief systems. I just wonder if you...
Yeah, so Mike was asking about the book Faithiest by Chris Stedman. Is that the surname? Chris something, isn't it? Oh, sorry, okay, right. Oh, that one. Sorry, I was thinking there's one written by an atheist called, because there's an atheist chaplain, I forget which university it is, called Chris Stedman, who's written a book called Faithiest. Now that's interesting because Chris's book is coming at from the other side. He's very cross with his own community for having these angry slanging matches, and he wants to see more creative engagement. And then yes, Chris Candia's book, Fatheism, is the book, isn't it? Is about from the Christian side. So the simple answer is yes. I think when you do open engagement, lots of good things happen. One of the main ways that I do public evangelism is I do a lot of dialogue events, not just university ones, but anywhere really. And my favorite type of event is to get somebody from a different worldview, an atheist maybe, or a Muslim, and rather than have a sort of slanging match, is to go, let's take a topic and have an intelligent discussion about it. And I think amazing things happen. You want to see a good example of how, hopefully, God willing, that's done well. Many of you may be aware of the Premier Radio Unbelievable show. Do any of you know that? A few of you nodding. So Premier Christian Radio do this show called Unbelievable, where they get a Christian and non-Christian to talk together. And it goes out every Saturday, and you can get the podcast and everything. But they've also been doing these series of what they call big conversations for the last year. And back in June, I had the privilege of sitting down and filming a dialogue with probably one of the leading atheist philosophers today. We're not talking the new atheist guys, we're talking the really big heavyweights. His name is Peter Singer. Based at Princeton University, incredible atheist thinker. I mean, also quite scary some of the places his atheism leads him. He's argued, for example, that you have a moral duty to abort a baby with Down syndrome. It's not that you can do it, you should do it. He's also argued that there's no reason why you can't engage in infanticide. There's no reason why birth should be the defining thing. So he'd be quite happy with aborting children up to 2 or 3 years old. I have a 3-year-old. There are moments. But anyway, so Peter and I had this conversation. So if you go to the Premier Radio website, I think that's sort of up there, and have a watch, because it's encouraging, Michael, I'd say, because it's a very honest discussion, but it's a very friendly, collegial discussion. Peter and I shook hands afterwards. He was a real gentleman. If I heard anyone say anything rude about his character, I would defend him to the hilt. I think you can have those kind of conversations, and it models something to the audience. And I think we need to find a way in our divided world, and I think it's something Christians can really contribute to the public good, actually, of showing how can we talk about those we disagree without being rude about them. I hope I've done that this morning. I've had some fun with some of the new atheist arguments, but I haven't stood there and gone, Richard Dawkins is a terrible man. I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's Christ-like. And I think, yes, when we engage well. So yes, Chris Candia, Kandiah, his book, Fatheism, just out in the last few weeks, I think. Really helpful book. And a really interesting, thought for mission, right? For those of you who are, because many of you are church leaders, it'd be interesting, right? Find out, is there a local mosque, Jehovah's Witness place, local secular group, near a university campus? Could you find someone of a different position to come to the church and do an event, for your congregation? The two of you have a dialogue. It'd be scary the first time you do it, but it becomes quite easy, actually. And amazing opportunities when we show people that we are willing to talk to those who think differently. And we don't need to be afraid, because if the gospel is true, it can stand up in the marketplace of ideas. And one of my favourite passages, and I'll end with this before we go into coffee, is that passage in Acts where we read of Paul there in Ephesus, and he goes and he rents the lecture hall of Tyrannus, and we're told he's there for 2 years, debating and engaging with both the Jews and the pagan Greeks. And I love the fact that Paul is like, okay, what's the best way to reach people here? Well, if I just preach in the house church around the corner, no one's going to come. So, right, okay, public square. And a few years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of going to Ephesus. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. Amazing place. And they showed us where they think of the ruins of the lecture hall of Tyrannus. And it's like right outside the library and all this kind of sort of public civic stuff. And there was Paul. And I was like, okay, that's the kind of person that I think more Christians need to reflect in today's world. Anyway, why don't I pray for us, if that's okay, and then we'll go into coffee. Father God, we do live in challenging times. The culture is shifting. Sometimes it feels a bit beneath our feet, and maybe some of us are wondering how we respond. But thank you that the gospel is true. It's not true because a certain number of people believe it. It's not true if it's, Britain remains a Christian country. It's true because it's true because it's true, because you came the person Jesus and ministered, lived, died, rose again. And that's true whether one person believes it or 10 billion people believe it. But Lord, would you give us a natural confidence in the gospel? Help us communicate that to those that we teach and lead, and help us be willing to engage those in our communities and neighbourhoods who are atheist or Muslim or anything that's not a Christian. Help us engage them in a way that's honest and confident and compassionate too. Might we do all of that in the light of that verse of Scripture, 1 Peter 3, verse 15. Always be willing to give a reason for the hope that we have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Help us do that, Lord. Forgive us where we haven't been as bold as we should. Fill us up, fire us up, and send us out. And Lord, I pray that through the folks here and their congregations that they serve and lead, would there be many who hear the gospel and even come to faith in Christ because of the work of these men and women. I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.